On a rainy October evening in the quiet town of Maplewood, Officer Daniel Hayes was nearing the end of his shift. The downpour blurred his windshield, and he looked forward to a hot meal and the comfort of home. Just as his thoughts wandered to rest, his radio crackled to life, reporting a possible domestic disturbance at 123 Elm Avenue. The caller? A 3-year-old boy. Dan initially thought it might be a prank or a child playing with the phone, but his instincts told him otherwise. With 2 decades of experience, he knew never to underestimate the seriousness of a call, especially one involving a child. Turning on his siren, he made his way to the address, a small, worn bungalow that seemed unremarkable, yet ominous in the pouring rain. As he approached the house, an overturned tricycle on the walkway caught his eye. The sound of faint sobs and thumps inside the home made his stomach churn. After knocking, a hesitant voice whispered from behind the door. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a frightened little boy clutching a teddy bear. Through trembling lips, the child explained that his grandfather had fallen and wouldn't wake up. Dan entered cautiously and found an elderly man sprawled on the floor, unconscious and bleeding from a head injury. His years of training kicked in as he assessed the man's weak pulse and shallow breathing. Calling for medical backup, Dan worked to reassure the boy, whose wide, tear-filled eyes were locked on his unconscious grandfather. Paramedics arrived, stabilizing the elderly man while Dan stayed with the boy, whose name he learned was Liam. As they sat together on the worn sofa, Dan gently probed, discovering that Liam had called for help just as his mother had taught him. Despite his young age, Liam had the courage and clarity to save his grandfather's life. Liam's bravery astounded Dan. The boy explained that his parents were overseas for work, leaving him in the care of his aging grandfather, who had been struggling with health issues. Dan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration and protectiveness toward Liam. At the hospital, Dan spoke with Mr. Miller, who expressed gratitude and concern for his grandson. As the conversation unfolded, Dan realized the challenges the family faced. Despite his declining health, Mr. Miller had been left to care for an energetic toddler, a situation that was becoming increasingly untenable. Back at the station, Dan wrestled with the moral dilemma of whether to report the family situation to Child Protective Services. After consulting with his captain, he decided it was the right thing to do to ensure Liam's safety. Over the following weeks, Dan frequently visited Liam and Mr. Miller, bringing groceries and small gifts for the boy. These visits deepened their connection. Dan became a father figure to Liam, teaching him how to throw a baseball, build forts, and explore the wonders of imagination. Liam, in turn, adored Dan, looking up to him as a hero. Their bond was a source of joy for Dan, a welcome reprieve from the harsh realities of his job. One evening, Dan was called away to investigate a string of robberies. The case demanded his full attention, pulling him away from his newfound family. Though he called regularly, Dan missed the warmth and simplicity of his evenings with Liam and Mr. Miller. Weeks later, after the case was resolved, Dan returned to Elm Avenue. Liam greeted him with pure joy, running into his arms. The sight of Liam's beaming face reminded Dan why he had become a police officer, to protect and serve, not just in the line of duty, but in the lives he touched along the way. Dan's presence became a fixture in Liam and Mr. Miller's lives, bringing stability and love to their small family. Whether it was helping with chores or sharing meals, Dan found fulfillment in these simple acts of kindness. Liam's laughter and curiosity brought light into Dan's world, while Mr. Miller's gratitude deepened their bond. In the end, Dan realized that family isn't always defined by blood, but by the love and care we give to one another. Through his actions, he not only saved lives, but also forged a connection that would endure, proving that even in the darkest moments, humanity and compassion can shine through. A few weeks after Liam's parents returned from their extended business trip, Dan, unsure of how they might react to his involvement in their lives, decided to give them space. He stayed away from Elm Avenue, immersing himself in work while trying to suppress the emptiness that had taken root in his heart. Though he reminded himself that his duty was done, that Liam was safe and cared for, the boy's bright smile Infectious laughter and joyful hugs lingered in his mind, filling him with an ache he couldn't ignore. One afternoon, while on patrol, Dan received a call from the dispatcher. Mr. and Mrs. Miller were at the station and wanted to see him. His heart raced with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation as he drove to meet them, unsure if he was about to face anger, resentment, or accusations of overstepping. Instead, he found a well-dressed couple with faces etched in gratitude and guilt. Mrs. Miller, her eyes rimmed with tears, held a bouquet of flowers, and Mr. Miller extended a hand, thanking Dan for everything he had done for Liam and their family. Mrs. Miller, her voice trembling with emotion, expressed relief that Liam had someone like Dan to care for him during their absence. Dan, unaccustomed to such heartfelt appreciation, felt his cheeks flush as he mumbled, "It was my pleasure." When Mrs. Miller mentioned that Liam called him his hero, Dan's heart swelled with pride and purpose. He had never seen himself as a hero, but the acknowledgement touched him deeply. Liam's parents explained their frequent business trips were a necessary sacrifice to secure a better future for their son. As successful entrepreneurs, their demanding work often took precedence, leaving Liam in the care of his grandfather. Yet, seeing social worker reports and reflecting on their choices forced them to confront how much they had neglected Liam's emotional needs. They expressed guilt over missed moments and vowed to make changes. Prioritizing family over work, they promised to be more present in Liam's life and even considered enrolling him in daycare to foster his social and emotional growth. Dan listened, moved by their sincerity. He offered his continued support, not as a police officer, but as a friend. Walking away from the station, Dan felt a profound sense of closure and pride. He had helped reunite a family, ensuring Liam would receive the love and care he deserved. Even after Mr. Miller recovered, Dan found himself drawn to Elm Avenue. He visited often, bringing groceries or small gifts for Liam, who delighted in dinosaurs and superheroes. Dan discovered Liam to be a bright, curious, and deeply sensitive child. Through their growing bond, Dan found renewed purpose and fulfillment, inspiring him to mentor at-risk youth and engage in community volunteer work. Dan became more than a friend to the family. He became an honorary uncle. He celebrated Liam's milestones, offered comfort during challenges, and cherished the everyday moments. Through these connections, Dan transformed. He realized true strength wasn't found in authority or physical prowess, but in empathy, kindness, and the willingness to help others. One evening, sitting with Mr. Miller on the porch, they watched Liam chase fireflies in the backyard. The air was filled with the boys' laughter, and Dan felt a deep sense of peace. "I never thought I'd find a place like this, a family like this," Dan admitted. Mr. Miller smiled, his gaze on Liam's joyful movements. "Life surprises you," he said. "It brings unexpected gifts, connections, and love." Dan nodded, his heart brimming with gratitude. He had received an unexpected gift, a family, a purpose, and a love that transcended blood ties. A simple act of kindness had blossomed into something extraordinary, changing lives and healing hearts in ways he could never have imagined. As the seasons changed, Dan's bond with Liam and his family deepened. The once quiet house on Elm Avenue now brimmed with laughter, the walls echoing with the sound of Liam's playful chatter and the clinking of dinnerware during shared meals. Dan's visits became part of the family's rhythm, and with each visit, he found himself more entrenched in their lives. One crisp autumn morning, Liam came running up to Dan, holding a tattered piece of paper covered in colorful drawings. "Look, Uncle Dan, it's my superhero story," he exclaimed, eyes shining with excitement. The story featured a brave hero named Officer Dan, who saved the day with his kindness and courage. Dan chuckled, feeling both amused and deeply touched. "You're quite the storyteller, Liam," Dan said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Maybe one day, you'll write books that everyone will read." Liam beamed at the compliment. "Will you help me make it better?" he asked. "Of course," Dan replied, sitting down with him. Together, they worked on Liam's story, adding more adventures and imagining daring rescues. What started as a simple pastime became a tradition, with Liam creating new stories each week and Dan helping him bring them to life. As winter approached, Dan noticed subtle changes in Mr. Miller. The older man, once lively and full of stories, seemed more fatigued. Concerned, Dan brought it up during one of their porch conversations. Mr. Miller waved him off with a smile. "Old age catching up, that's all," he said, but Dan wasn't convinced. One snowy evening, after dinner, Mrs. Miller confided in Dan. "He's been forgetting things," she said, her voice tinged with worry. "Small things at first, but now, it's more noticeable. He doesn't remember conversations, and he gets disoriented sometimes." Dan's heart sank. "Have you spoken to a doctor?" he asked. "We're planning to," she replied. "But he's stubborn. He doesn't want to admit anything's wrong." Dan offered his support, promising to help in any way he could. He started spending more time with Mr. Miller, engaging him in conversations and activities that would keep his mind sharp. They played chess, reminisced about old times, and worked on small projects around the house. Dan became a quiet pillar of strength for the family, helping them navigate this uncertain chapter. One afternoon, while Dan was visiting, Liam tugged at his sleeve. "Uncle Dan, can we build a snowman?" he asked, his cheeks rosy from the cold. Dan couldn't resist. They bundled up and headed into the yard, their laughter ringing out as they rolled snowballs and shaped them into a towering snowman. As they worked, Liam turned to Dan and asked, "Do you think Grandpa will get better?" Dan paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people face challenges that don't go away, buddy," he said gently. "But what matters is that we're here for him. We make him happy, and that's the best medicine." Liam nodded solemnly, then added a bright scarf to the snowman. "Then I'll make sure he's happy every day." Dan smiled, pride swelling in his chest. Liam's resilience and compassion reminded him of why he had chosen to be part of this family. They had given him, as much as he had given them, a sense of belonging, a purpose. As the years went by, the Millers adjusted to their new normal. Mr. Miller's health challenges were met with patience and love, and Liam grew into a thoughtful, kind-hearted boy. Dan continued to play a central role in their lives, not just as a protector, but as a friend, mentor, and family member. One spring day, as they celebrated Liam's 10th birthday, Dan looked around at the gathered friends and family, the house alive with joy and warmth. He realized that his life had taken a path he never could have predicted, a path that began with a small act of kindness and had grown into something extraordinary. In that moment, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Life, with all its twists and turns, had brought him home. The birthday party wound down as twilight painted the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Liam, now surrounded by a pile of open presents, held up a simple scrapbook Dan had given him. Inside were photographs, drawings, and stories they had created together over the years. "This is my favorite gift, Uncle Dan," Liam said, hugging him tightly. "Because it's all about us." Dan swallowed the lump in his throat, smiling through the emotions swelling within him. "Well, kiddo, you're my favorite story," he said softly. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Mr. Miller settled into his rocking chair, a peaceful smile on his face as he watched his grandson dart around the yard, chasing fireflies. Mrs. Miller sat beside him, her hand resting on his, their bond stronger than ever as they faced the challenges ahead. Dan stood quietly on the porch, the laughter of the family he had chosen filling his heart. The weight of his badge felt lighter now. It wasn't just about duty anymore. It was about connection, about making a difference in ways that transcended his role as an officer. For the first time in a long while, Dan felt truly whole. Life had thrown its share of hardships, but it had also delivered unexpected joy, a family bound not by blood, but by love and shared experiences. He had found his purpose, not in grand heroics, but in the quiet, powerful moments of simply being there. As the evening settled into stillness, Mr. Miller's voice broke the silence. "You've done more for us than we could ever repay, Dan. Your family now. Always." Dan nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." The porch fell quiet again, the sound of Liam's laughter carrying through the cool night air. Dan took a deep breath, the crisp scent of spring filling his lungs. He had come to Elm Avenue by chance, but he stayed by choice. This was where he belonged, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't searching for anything else. He had everything he needed right here. As the weeks turned into months, life on Elm Avenue blossomed with new beginnings. Liam thrived with his parents more present in his life, and Mr. Miller's health improved steadily under the watchful care of both family and friends. The neighborhood came alive with the echoes of laughter, shared meals, and late-night conversations on porches. Dan, too, embraced this new chapter. Though his work as a police officer remained demanding, his time with Liam and the Millers became a sanctuary, a reminder of the good that could come from small acts of kindness and connection. He continued to mentor at-risk youth in the community, organizing weekend activities that offered a safe space for kids to learn, play, and dream. One Saturday, while Liam was showing Dan his latest drawing of a dinosaur superhero hybrid, Mrs. Miller approached them with a warm smile. "Dan, there's something we've been meaning to talk to you about." Dan looked up from the drawing, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What's on your mind?" She exchanged a glance with Mr. Miller, who nodded encouragingly. "We were wondering if you'd consider being Liam's godfather." Dan blinked, momentarily stunned. "Godfather?" he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes," Mr. Miller said. "You've been more than a friend to our family, Dan. You've been a protector, a guide, and a constant source of love and support. We can't think of anyone better to fill that role in Liam's life." Liam looked up from his drawing, his eyes wide with excitement. "Does that mean you'll always be my Uncle Dan?" Dan chuckled, pulling Liam into a hug. "Always, buddy. Always." The days that followed were filled with preparations for Liam's baptism, a family affair that brought the community together. On the day of the ceremony, Dan stood proudly by Liam's side, his heart brimming with a sense of belonging and purpose. As the ceremony concluded, Dan found himself surrounded by well-wishers. The Millers' gratitude was evident in every glance and smile, and Liam's boundless energy and joy lit up the room. Later that evening, as the family gathered around a fire pit in the backyard, Dan sat back and soaked in the warmth of the moment. Liam was nestled beside him, his head resting on Dan's shoulder. "You know," Dan said softly, looking at the fireflies dancing in the twilight, "I think I needed this family as much as you all needed me." Mr. Miller raised his glass in a silent toast, his eyes glistening with emotion. "To unexpected blessings," he said. "To family," Dan added, his voice steady with conviction. Liam yawned, his eyes fluttering closed as he murmured, "To Uncle Dan, my hero." In that quiet moment, as the stars shimmered above, Dan felt the weight of the past lift completely. He was no longer the man searching for purpose. He had found it, right here, in the laughter, love, and light of a family he had helped build. The journey had been unexpected, but it had led him exactly where he was meant to be.